Hello and welcome to a little discussion on a big topic. I've called it, is this what Matthew, Mark, Luke and John wrote? Or are our modern copies of the Bible different from the original? This is an extremely important question, of course, for everybody to know how reliable these modern Bibles that we have are. Do they really reflect what the original writers wrote all those thousands of years ago? Or have they been changed a bit? Or have they been changed a lot? Are they, like an article in Newsweek magazine in January 2015 suggested, that our modern Bibles are translations of translations of translations, of copies of copies of copies. So a bit like perhaps that old game of Chinese whispers where a message is whispered to the next person and it's passed around the circle. By the time it's been passed around the circle, it's changed completely. Are our modern copies of the Bible like that? Well, the article in Newsweek directly suggested that, and it seems like a lot of people have that idea, so it's worth investigating. By the way, in this particular talk, I'm not talking about translation. I did a separate little video recently talking about English Bible translations, choosing English Bible translations, and in that I touched on how reliable our translations are. So this time I'm just talking about how certain are we that we have the originals that Matthew, Mark, Luke, John and the other Bible writers wrote in the original languages, Greek in the case of the New Testament and Hebrew mostly in the case of the Old Testament. How certain are we of the exact words that they wrote all those thousands of years ago? And it's a very important question. This video will only deal with some of the basic issues involved, but I'll give a bibliography that will enable anybody that's interested, and it's certainly of interest to everybody, I would suggest, to delve into it a little bit further. Also, I'll try to avoid technical terminology as I do in my little series on teaching Greek and Hebrew. So, okay, but just before we get into looking at the Bible, I should point out that this question of establishing what the original author wrote is of interest not only to people who study the Bible. For example, for fans of Bob Dylan, who wrote that song, Mr. Tambourine Man. Do you think I should sing it now? Maybe not, maybe not. Maybe my voice would not be quite as good as Bob Dylan's, or depending on your point of view, you might say even worse than Bob Dylan's. But I love that song, Mr. Tambourine Man. Hey, Mr. Tambourine Man, play a song for me. I'm not sleepy and there ain't no place I'm going to. But other versions of that song say, I'm not sleepy and there is no place I'm going to. So here's a question. What did Bob Dylan write? And there are various ways that we can try to find out. But I'll put that aside for now. Maybe something you can think about. It's a worthwhile exercise to think about that. How could you find out? Especially assuming that you didn't have any original copies by Bob Dylan, which is the case that we have with the Bible. We don't have the original manuscripts that Matthew, Mark, Luke, John and the other Bible writers wrote, but we only have copies of them. So the issue is to try and find out, well, exactly what they did write. And we can say that even though they wrote 2,000 years ago, in the case of the Old Testament, several more thousand years before that, we can be pretty confident that we do have pretty close to exactly what they wrote. So how can we make that claim? So let's have a look at that. So I have three main reasons for saying that we can determine pretty reliably what the original writers wrote. The first is because of the abundance of the evidence that we have. And here's a quote: "The evidence for our New Testament writings is ever so much greater than the evidence for many writings of classical authors, the authenticity of which no one dreams of questioning." So that's a quote by F.F. Bruce, the great British Bible scholar of the 20th century, who wrote a book called "Are the New Testament Documents Reliable?" Bruce goes on to say, "There are in existence at least 3,000 Greek manuscripts of the New Testament, in whole or in part." He compares this with some other ancient manuscripts, for example, the writings of the Roman historian Tacitus. Less than half of what he wrote, of what we know that he wrote, survives, and even for those portions we're dependent on 2 copies that date to nearly 1,000 years after Tacitus lived. In contrast, we have 2 excellent complete copies of the New Testament dating to about 200 years after Christ lived. Also, we have some very interesting fragments found long buried in the dry sands of Egypt. The earliest of these is dated to about 120 AD. And these fragments provide us with a sort of spot check on the accuracy of the later complete manuscripts that we have. And they came out very well. So there we are, the Roman historian Tacitus. Less than half of what we know he wrote survives, and even for those portions we're dependent on 2 copies that date to nearly 1,000 years after him. And the fragments there, the earliest dated to around 120 AD. Okay, and our main topic here is the New Testament, but I have another example that relates to the Old Testament. And here it is. This little charred lump. This is called the En-Gedi scroll. The En-Gedi scroll, and all it is really is a little charred lump of paper. It was discovered in Israel in 1970, and it dated to around 700 BC. So that makes it hundreds of years older than even the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were in themselves an amazing find. I'm not going to talk about them here, but it's they really turned the world of Bible scholarship, well, I wouldn't say upside down, but they were quite a sensation, because they were about 1,000 years older than the oldest manuscripts we had before then. But here's a tiny damaged fragment that's about 500 years older than the Dead Sea Scrolls. But it was impossible to read, as you can imagine. Being a scroll, it had been rolled up, and it had also been in a fire, so the gentlest touch might crumble it irretrievably. But just this year, researchers at the University of Kentucky have managed to read it. Amazing. First they made a digital scan, then they applied a new software that they developed called virtual unwrapping. The software is designed to detect the individual pages based on their expected geometry, then to texture it, that is, to look for changes in brightness on the surfaces identified as pages. All this seems just so remarkable when you look at this what it is. But in the scanning they found dense areas, once covered in ink for example, which appear brighter in the scan. Then the software flattens out the rolled up text, showing the words as they would appear on a two-dimensional surface. And I got this information from an article in the Washington Post in September 2016. And it turns out to be part of the book of Leviticus. And again, this will provide a spot check on the manuscripts we have, which date from centuries later. So, our first point was the abundance of the evidence. The abundance of the evidence. And our second point is that the scribes worked very carefully. This is especially true of the old Hebrew scribes copying out their Hebrew Bible, the Christian Old Testament. They devised a complicated system of safeguards against mistakes. I'm getting this information again from F.F. Bruce. They counted, for example, the number of times each letter of the alphabet occurs in each book. They took note of the middle letter of the Bible and lots more things besides. So the scribes worked very carefully. And then, third thing, the methods used by scholars today for comparing and evaluating manuscripts are pretty good. And I might add, methods for reading ancient manuscripts. And as we saw with the En-Gedi scroll, sometimes they're very hard to read. In another seeming case where it's made it seemingly impossible to read the original, sometimes ancient manuscripts were scrubbed clean and reused. This would be parchment, which is quite valuable. To make a big book, you might need to slaughter a whole herd of cows or goats to make the parchment, which was dried animal skin, to be written on. This was before paper came into use. And so maybe several hundred years later, you could get a case where, say, an original manuscript was written in 500 AD, then maybe in 1500 AD, the monks decided this old manuscript was hard to read and useless, so they would scrub it clean and reuse it. But now we want to read what was originally written on it. And a newly developed method researchers are using involves backlighting each page with multiple wavelengths that reveal where the ink of the undertext had eroded the parchment. These images, once processed and viewed in combination, render long-lost words legible. So, those are three reasons we can be pretty confident that we know what was originally written. And in fact, most of the differences between the manuscripts are pretty insignificant, like just spelling mistakes. But there are just a few differences that are of reasonable significance. So another question arises. Are the differences all the result of accidental mistakes? Or are some of them deliberate? And scholars studying the ancient manuscripts and their differences have developed techniques for dealing with both these types of differences that are found between the manuscripts. And changes that are made on purpose are a little bit harder to detect, so they take more detective work. We'll now look at two interesting examples. The first comes in the Lord's Prayer, Matthew 6, verse 13. After deliver us from evil, we often say, for thine is the kingdom, the power and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. This extra bit is in some manuscripts but not others. So our question is, did Matthew himself write this? Did Matthew write this? Now, it's a very good thing to say, and a lot of people love it, and we often recite it, but the question for our purpose is, did Matthew write it? Is it part of the original gospel? And this is the type of study that we're looking at. Our first clue is that it's not found in the oldest and best manuscripts. Where we do find it is in the Old Testament, in 1 Chronicles 29. We find it in 1 Chronicles 29, 11 to 13. So it looks like, and there's some pretty good other evidence that early Christians added it on from there when they said the Lord's Prayer, because it seemed like a good way to round the prayer off. And then later it got copied into new manuscripts of Matthew's Gospel. So the result of our investigation is we can be pretty sure that Matthew didn't write this final sentence. The words are nice, but the issue is, did Matthew write this? And we can be as good as certain, really we can be as good as certain, even though if you were going to put a number on it, the probability would be, say, 99%, so there is like a 1% probability that he did write it. But for all intents and purposes, really, we can be as good as certain that Matthew didn't write it. Another interesting example comes from Luke 2:14, the message of the angels at the time of Jesus' birth. And a single Greek letter omitted from the end changes the meaning from peace to people on whom God's favor rests to peace on earth, or peace and God's favor to all people. So you see, this one here is seeming to reduce the number of people concerned. Peace to people on whom God's favor rests, like only those on whom God's favor rests. Whereas this one is saying peace and God's favor to all people. And this, it looks quite different in English, but in Greek, all it takes is a single letter omitted from the end to change the meaning from this to this. And this is what we find in the King James Bible, for example. Peace on earth, goodwill toward men. So that's basically saying, you know, all people towards men, not a restricted group, using men in the sense of people, but meaning all people. Now it seems likely that Luke himself wrote the first one, peace to people on whom God's favour rests. It's pretty clear from two good early manuscripts that this is the original reading, and omitting the letter that made it then mean God's favour to all people happened later. There are traces of this having happened on the manuscripts themselves. And so then we'd have to ask, well, why would someone want to make that change? Is there a logical reason to explain it? And the reason would be a desire to make it cover everyone. Or perhaps, and also perhaps because the Greek, the original way, was a little bit harder to understand. So somebody, perhaps a scribe or maybe even some group of influential Christian leaders decided they would, oh look, it will make a lot more sense if we cut out that last letter, then it gives us a much better message, and it's a little bit easier to understand in the Greek. So they, perhaps, you know, in all honesty, they thought, well, maybe that's really what Luke intended, or maybe they thought they could improve on Luke. Well, whatever you might think about that, the evidence seems to be pretty strong that that's what Luke wrote. I mean, the probabilities could go the other way. It could have been that this was what Luke wrote, but some other people wanted to make it a little more exclusive. So we are dealing in not in certainties, but in probabilities, even though the probabilities are high. So again, sorry if you like this one, but someone else might have a different opinion. And what we really at here is we really want to know, what did Luke originally write? What's the original text of the Bible? So we come back now to the little question we asked at the beginning. Hey, Mr. Tambourine Man, I'm not sleepy and there ain't no place I'm going to, or I'm not sleepy and there is no place I'm going to. Well, first of all, we try to think, is there a reason for somebody to change one to the other? And I think we can say that Bob Dylan himself, being a famous man, a big man, wouldn't be worried about people criticizing his grammar, but maybe some lesser singers or groups that made copies of the song would be perhaps a little bit more sensitive to their grammar being grammar mistake being pointed out. So they might have changed "I'm not sleepy and there ain't no place I'm going to" "I'm not sleepy and there is no place I'm going to," as in the version of the Byrds. So, but there still is a possibility that someone could have changed it back the other way, for I don't know what reason. So again, we're dealing in probabilities. But perhaps to clinch the issue, I think we're lucky enough to have still, well, Bob Dylan himself is still alive, and you can get, there are available recordings of Dylan himself singing it, and you can verify this, but I think you'll find that Dylan himself sings "There ain't no place I'm going to." So just as Dylan fans want to know exactly what the great man himself wrote, we want to know exactly what the Bible writers themselves wrote, not what somebody might have changed it to by careless mistake, or what somebody might have changed it to because they thought they could improve on it in some way or another. And we can determine pretty exactly, despite the gap of all those thousands of years. But it's important to say, because some people overstate the case, some people state the case as if we know down to the last letter. Well, that's not quite true. We do have to deal in probabilities. It's not quite the case of, like Joseph Smith claimed to have found the Book of Mormon written on gold plates by the hand of an angel. So the case isn't quite as strong as that. But differences of any real significance in the Bible concern only a very few cases, and the probabilities are high, the type of probabilities that we normally accept in life, in day-to-day life anyway. But I think we can say that we owe a big debt to the smart and hard-working scholars that have worked hard for generations now to pore over these ancient manuscripts, and have developed all kinds of techniques to read them better and better. And to me, one of the most encouraging and exciting things is that we're zeroing in better and better all the time on what the original writers wrote, which is exactly the opposite to the rather pessimistic view expressed, as I said at the beginning, in the Newsweek article, that we only have copies of copies of copies, as if we're getting further and further away from it. No, the truth is we're actually zeroing in closer and closer to the original all the time. So in this little presentation we've been trying to find out what the original authors of the Bible wrote. The technical name for this task is textual criticism. And here's some more reading on the topic. First a couple by F.F. Bruce, the great 20th century Bible scholar, and then one by Bruce Metzger, an American scholar who's worked in this field for a lifetime. Then another article in the Bible Translator magazine. I mentioned this in the other video that I did. It's a good source of a lot of information on all these areas, and here's one article that's available free on the internet. And then about the En-Gedi scroll that I mentioned. Again, there's several things on the web, but I recommend the go to the Israel Antiquities Association, so you could just Google En-Gedi scroll and the Israel Antiquities Association comes up about third on the list when I did it. So all these things, as I said, are of great interest and importance to us, establishing what the original writers of the Bible actually wrote.